might be looking for something that the elk need that is in less supply. So let's say I'm hunting an arid place. Well, what's in less supply most years would be water. So then that's going to be where I focus my initial efforts.
All right, what is up, everybody? We got him, the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Remi Warren, sitting across from us digitally. But I will say his digital setup is probably the best we've seen. Remi, you're coming through crystal clear. We're going to be talking elk, and actually specifically how to find elk, and the old, cliche, the old adage, you got to find them to kill them, and that really is step one, and that's why we have probably the best man for the job that I'm aware of, Remi, to tell us how to find these darn things. Earlier, Remi, we were talking pre-cast, and it's like you're ready to talk elk, and then you started talking elk and making all sorts of elk sounds, and then I'm even more fired up right now. So,
yeah, the little ew, ew, ew. Oof. Whoa, what's going on? That's a little bit of elk talk for you. Yeah, I mean, when I think about elk hunting, it's really just 3 steps: find the elk, kill the elk, pack the elk back to the truck. And oftentimes people struggle with step 1. So it's a good one to talk about, because without step 1, you can't go to step 2.
This is very true. And I mean, they're all hard steps, but yeah, you don't get the other steps without conquering step 1. So, yeah. Some questions that I have as far as even before, I should just let you talk because, but now I've got these questions. So I'm going to say my question. Before you even get to where you're going to hunt elk. And I'd say maybe thinking of this in the context of a person, maybe an out-of-state hunter, you don't get a ton of boots on the ground time, and maybe you haven't hunted this unit before, or this state before, you don't have a ton of experience there. What are you keeping in mind to be I'm going to focus on these areas, I'm going to use these tools to maybe narrow down my focus a little bit of how to find elk?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is you got to identify the season that you're hunting. So are you hunting archery season? Are you hunting rifle season? Are you hunting a late season, an early season? Because elk do different things throughout the year. And so first I got to identify, okay, what are we pinpointing? What kind of behavior are we going to pinpoint to find the elk? Then I'm going to kind of take that knowledge and then probably do a lot of e-scouting, digital scouting on my maps. And I'm looking for a few key things, probably no matter the season. There's a couple things that I really like. I like to focus on big south faces, good feeding areas, or if there's an area where, everywhere is different, where you might be hunting desert country in New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona might be different than Montana, alpine country, Idaho, Utah, that kind of stuff. So in those places, I might be looking for something that the elk need that is in less supply. So let's say I'm hunting an arid place. Well, what's in less supply most years would be water. So then that's going to be where I focus my initial efforts. Now, if I'm looking at Montana or Idaho, there's water in every little creek and drainage. Water's not an issue. And maybe cover's not an issue. Maybe it's really thick. But what might be an issue is a good food source, a good grass supply. So I'm looking, okay, out of all this timber, where's some good meadows and some openings that are going to have some really good feed? So I try to narrow it down based on that particular area and what's in, what is needed and in the least supply. And that's how I kind of start based off the area. And then I kind of dive in based on the season and my particular hunting style. So I like to think about hunting for elk the way that you like to hunt. If you're a guy that likes to still hunt, then I'm going to find terrain that's, conducive to that. If I'm a guy that likes to glass, I'm going to find good glassable country. If it's during the rut and they're calling, I'm personally probably going to find more timbered country because I like to call them in close. So it's a lot, right? Because it just depends on your scenario. But if you really tailor your e-scouting to your specific hunt season, hunt style, in the area, you're already going to be on the right track.
I like it. I don't know if this will work or not, but in my mind, what if we kind of took this, from season to season? Let's look at how you're going to attack that archery season, maybe as that transitions into potentially maybe a muzzleloader season or an early rifle season. And then maybe even some of those late seasons that are out there as well, which, like you said, it all depends on the state because a late season hunt in Montana is going to maybe differ quite a bit from a late season hunt in Arizona. So it's really, it's the wear is really such a, it's such a factor that dictates so much, but also at the same day, it seems like elk are elk in some ways.
Definitely, yeah. Like elk doing elk things. That was like when I started guiding, I knew how to hunt elk really well, and I could go pretty much anywhere and find elk. So I'd hunt Montana, I'd go do my own hunts in Idaho or Wyoming or wherever. Wherever I hunted elk, it's like, yeah, we're finding elk because we know what elk do. I think like if you're talking the archery season, there's a few different stages through archery season. So if we're talking the entire month of September, the first week of September, I often expect the bigger bulls to be off on their own still, and probably in the higher reaches of the area, still in their summer range. What happens is the cows start to gather at that mid-range, and not that you won't find others in all these other places. This is just like, if you were just like to break down odds, this would be like 68% do this, right? So you're just a little bit more doing this than the other thing. But in a lot of areas, the cows, first part of the season, the big bulls kind of wait until the harems are gathered up by other bulls and kind of their other thing, and then they go in there and fight for them. They aren't going to fight the entire month of September for it. So it depends on what kind of elk you're looking for. If you're just looking for numbers, go where those cows are, because there will be satellite bulls or smaller bulls or raghorn bulls or even sometimes really nice bulls that just aren't as mature. You never know. But so generally, like I'd go high. I'd look for those bulls in their summer range. This is primarily for guys that have scouted and targeting a specific bull before he moves off that summer range. Then as that season progresses, now the focus becomes primarily on cows and pockets of cow elk. If you know where the cows are, you know where the bulls are going to be. So then I really kind of like focus on where the cows are from the second week of September, pretty much through the rest of September. And then as that season, you start to get into beginning of October, you still do get rut activity. I've heard bulls bugling as late as October 20th or even later. Not the norm, but often those bigger herds as you start to get into October are made up of younger bulls trying to run the cows, and then those bigger bulls split off on their own and they go into like solitary pockets, but they will pop back in and out of those herds. They just aren't as connected to those herds. So it kind of depends on the elk you're hunting. And then as we start to go into like rifle seasons, most places, late October into November, you've got the same deal where the mature bulls generally have broken off from the herds, but the nice thing about herds is they're easier to find, and there often is legal bulls in them. So I was telling you earlier, I'm like a professional raghorn killer. And so, hey, man, like if you want to stack some meat in the freezer and you've got a bull tag, you can still focus on those big groups of cows, because oftentimes they'll still hold a few bulls that'll trail through the season. So the bulls have now split off. They're kind of in their isolated pockets. And then as winter starts to go, sometimes the more mature bulls are the last ones to move through. Depends on the area. It could be a migration area, could not. They're more isolated. They often will be higher in elevation, which, surprises some people. As like snow starts to fall, there's still bulls up high. They just got to have somewhere to eat. And then as winter goes, then the bulls start to bachelor up and the cows start to group up. And then you go back into like a reverse summer pattern where it's like bulls bachelored, cows grouped up, and generally lower in that like really good winter range. A lot of south-facing slopes as we get into that like later season. Food's the primary focus when you're talking about late season, so you got to focus on places where there's food. If it's really cold, places where there's sun. Like one of my favorite tactics is just get super cold temperatures and go glass where the elk are staying warm, and that's a lot of fun too.
I like it. That's awesome. When you're talking about, I guess like that middle part of September when the cows have been herded up, where or even before that, but like what are areas, like where do the cows like to be? It seems like, early on, like they're split off, like where are those cows and what are they doing? So a person can focus on maybe terrain features or habitats that maybe they didn't see an elk, maybe they haven't heard an elk, but they can use their aerial scouting or their boots on the ground and be like, well, I think this is like a likely area that there might be some cows in.
Yeah, I think one of the things about cows is like they're a herd animal, and as a herd, that's how they have their safety, right? So they survive by being in a group. And oftentimes, one of the things that herds do, it doesn't matter what kind of species it is, you kind of tend to find these patterns out of the herd where they've got circuits that keep them fairly safe. So they kind of are familiar with the territory. And that's when a bull comes in, he kind of disrupts that. Like a herd has like a lead cow for the most part. Like they kind of follow into this pecking order. And then that cow keeps them safe. So what I look for what I call bulls or like micro habitats, where there's one area that has a little bit of everything they need. It's got food, it's got water, it's got cover, it's got habitat. And then in that, it's generally you find that kind of mid elevation in the mountain. It doesn't matter how high. Like if you've got a 10,000 foot peak and a 5,000 foot valley, I kind of would say that they'd probably be at that 6,000 to 8,000 range. If your mountain tops out at 8,000 and the valley's 3,000, they're probably at that 5,000 to 6,000 range, right? Like they're kind of at that top, like the top third. If you cut the mountain into thirds, they're in that like middle third of the mountain, I would say. Like not the top third, not the bottom third, kind of that mid range. And obviously, like there are elk that hit the bottom, especially if there's agriculture. But food is a primary factor for a herd. And you think about a lot of elk together, 100 elk together, they need to eat. And that herd is designed to stay safe and survive. So they need food and water. And they're definitely going to need some cover. But I try to focus on that band of elevation and then those pockets where, hey, they've got everything they need here. And that's where I try to primarily change my focus to in mid-September.
Gotcha. On if you were to describe a typical elk's day, like, you know, and maybe even like coinciding with a hunter's day, right? Like what are they doing early in the morning? What are they doing midday? And then what are they doing in that afternoon? And what can the hunter maybe, you know, how should they coordinate their day to correspond with that?
Yeah. I mean, first thing in the morning, they're feeding, then they move off to bedding, and then they do like a reverse pattern back to feeding in the evening. So I try to be glassing feeding areas first light, hunting more bedding areas in the middle of the day, and then always glassing or figuring out feeding areas in the evening.
If you were like, you know, I know I've been in a couple situations where like you glass up some elk in the morning and, you know, either you don't really have a great approach and, you know, they move off and you know they're going off to bed. And maybe the answer is it depends, but what would you say like a hunter should do at that point? Like, hey, I found elk, but they're not moving my direction. They're going somewhere else. Would you say, hey, I'm going to bank on these elk coming back into this area tonight, and I'm either going to try and ambush or be closer at that point in time? Are you going to go dog them and head after them? Are you going to try and cut them off? Like, what would you say is like the most high odds, you know, strategy? And like I said, it might depend on the situation, but you know, what's your go-to generally?
Yeah, if I see elk feeding in the morning, then I just take the day to get up to where they're at and then wait for the evening. Because generally, you're playing kind of a little bit of a chess game, right? You kind of have to know the area a little bit, but for the most part, like even in an area where I don't know the area, I would bank on being in that area for the evening.
Gotcha. And then you talked a little bit about, you know, elk being on a bit of a circuit, if you will. Like how much are they moving generally? And again, maybe that depends on, you know, whether it's a bull or a cow or the time of year, but like, can you, I don't know, it's always such a gamble. It's like you said, you go up there and then you wait. Obviously, you know, there's good odds that they're going to come back, but maybe they're on the rest of their circuit. You know, how are you figuring that out?
Yeah, it's mostly a pressure thing. So, like, if they aren't pressured, they're pretty consistent. I mean, I've watched elk in an area that's unpressured, and they do the same thing every day for, like, months, you know, like clockwork. But then you go to an area where they're highly pressured, like maybe it's a general unit and there's hunters all over. I kind of find that those elk make a 3 to 4 day circuit. And then there's elk that, like, will do something for the most part pretty consistently until pressure hits, and then they kind of change it up. And when they change it up, they're probably hitting somewhere along that circuit. I kind of learned this just based off of, knowing a certain bull in a group, and then just like watching them and knowing different areas and going, okay, the elk aren't here. And then I go to this other spot. Okay, they aren't there. This other spot. Oh, here they are. And then just like taking a lot of notes throughout the season over the years and going, okay, man, these elk are doing kind of the same thing. And I ended up in some areas building out like that I knew really well. Like, okay, if they aren't here, then they're probably here. And then having multiple elk kind of in different circuits where you go, okay, you can kind of get their pattern a little bit. And you think about like whitetail hunters, right? Like the strategy is patterning a buck. You can, in a lot of ways, pattern a herd of elk. Sometimes it just takes a lot more country and a lot more like getting around. But they definitely are. I would say they are creatures of habit for sure.
Okay, cool. When I think about pressure, I oftentimes think about it like from like as a negative, right? Like it's like, oh man, I got into this area and there's a ton of people, a ton of pressure, which I'd say like oftentimes it is. It can disrupt animals that you're chasing. You could get to a spot and there's a person there. Is it ever like? Have you ever been able to use it like? Well, I'm sure you've been able to use it to your advantage, but like, has that ever been like a key thing where you're like, I know when all the pressure moves in to go here, and it's almost like you have people focusing the elk to a very specific spot that you can bank on?
Yeah, definitely. I've killed a lot of elk that way, of just like, especially opening day, where it's like, okay, there's a couple things that happen that actually is in your advantage. The first is, well, you can like oftentimes anticipate where they're going to go if you know their escape routes and other things. So you be the one that kind of catches people's mistakes, and a lot of people make a lot of mistakes, or maybe don't even like. You have to really know the elk in the area. Like if there's a lot of people that don't know what you might know if you know the animals and where they're at. So you can find like we do a lot of plays where we're like, we're going to go here because this is where they get pushed to when they get pressure, and we were really successful that way. The other nice thing when there is pressure is elk will tend to get out of their pattern. And when they get out of their pattern, they do dumb stuff because they just like, they'll go to places that they generally wouldn't be because they're trying to avoid pressure where they like to be. And so by knowing that, you can actually catch elk in some really weird places. And when you catch elk in really weird places, it's not really advantageous for them because they don't know that it's dangerous, if that makes sense. Like they're just kind of on the move. And actually, being mobile and like I prefer to do a lot of glassing in that because you just don't know where you're going to catch elk. There's some places where you will never see elk ever unless they've gotten pushed there, and so it benefits you to just be like, if you're in an area right that you've never been, you're like, how do I, not knowing this area or the elk, adapt to pressure? And I think the key is like find good vantages and look over a lot of country, because when there's a lot of pressure, elk are moving, makes them easier to spot. They put themselves in dumb places because they don't, their patterns are to put themselves in safe places. And when they get pushed out of those safe places, they can be in some weird spots. So I think that the best tactic is to just like find a great vantage and look over as much country as possible.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting, but it's like, check out like the weird, unassuming spots where you might not expect to see an elk, but that might be where you find them because of all that pressure.
Yeah. Like it was weird. Like a few years ago, it's just like a place where you'd never see an elk. We killed a bull one year that was like, I watched it from a mile away. There was like all these trucks driving, and this elk just like walked off the mountain and bedded 250 yards below the road in this like patch of timber that was like, like regrowth. And when he's bedding there, I watched glassing like 5 or 6 vehicles drive past it, and he was just bedded in there. And then we went over and shot it. I was like, but I would have never seen it if I wasn't just like far away looking, over everything. And like, there's no doubt in my mind that unless that elk was pushed there, he would never have chose that place because it's just not a place. But like, he was off his pattern. He's just like, I got to find somewhere safe. I'll duck in here. Cool. So it worked. I mean, it didn't work for him. It worked for us, but
it worked for a while.
Yeah. It worked for a while. There was a lot of people that it fooled. So.
Well, and then sometimes I wonder too, like, how many times has that elk done that? Has he done that a lot, or was that just that first instance where he just got, boogered out of there and he's like, I'm going to go over here. Like, I don't know. Or has that worked a lot of times,
I don't know. My assumption is like I think it's just they get in like flight mode and they just go until they can find somewhere to duck into and feel safe. They're like, it's unfamiliar. I feel safe. And that's only when they get a lot of pressure, like they've been bumped off their route or whatever, then they tend to do that kind of stuff.
Gotcha. What, as the bulls, you get into those later seasons and, well, like you said, smaller bulls will oftentimes hang with the herd. And then those bigger bulls, as they're, maybe not rutting, recovering from the rut, what types of places are they seeking out then? Because, like you said, you're not necessarily seeing those guys with the main group. Are they close by, but just not with? Or are they in the deepest, darkest hole, nasty spot they can find? Like, maybe not even glassable,
Yeah, I think that's mostly the case. Like they're in pretty big like pockets that are hard to get into. It's got a little bit of everything they need, but they don't need, like you're talking one elk. So they can actually live in the timber pretty well. Like they don't need that good food source because they'll just find it in the timber. And they often do that. Like for the most part, a lot of those elk that I found that way later in the season, maybe I'll see like an opening that's, I don't know, 5 feet wide, right? And you just like catch some antler tips glass, and you're like, ooh, okay, but you've been watching that spot for a while, and you know that elk's living in that pocket somewhere. That happens, and then they start to pop back out, and like once they've kind of recuperated from the rut, they start to pop back out into more heavy feeding patterns a little bit later, and then you'll start to see them as they start to transition or migrate out of that area. Oftentimes, they go back up. I would say not fully to where they were in the summer, but they do split off, and they can be in that top third of the mountain later on too. But then, honestly, it can be weird because some of them will like seek refuge wherever they can seek refuge. So the trouble is, I think this gets overlooked a lot. Is like a lot of those elk might even pull. Think about like an average hunting unit. There's private property on a lot of units, right? There's like, whether it's in the bottom or whatever. And sometimes those elk know that that's where they're the safest. So they just pull off, which is kind of a bummer. But a lot of units, the best bulls get sucked into like the magnet of safety on private land. And then sometimes you'll start catching them as they exit that private land later, which, you always think, oh, they're going up in the high country. And they're like, nah, I'm ducking down into these ag fields on the edge and just living my life, right? They know where they aren't getting pressure. So that happens too. I think that kind of gets overlooked. But if anybody that's elk hunted any amount of time, you know that you can like drive through these big, like there's a road around swath of private, and you're like, oh, all day long in the wide open out in this ridge, there's a herd of 150 elk, and they're just not moving, right? And they just know that they're safe there. So that happens as well.
Interesting. Yes, I've seen that before. What these bulls that during the later seasons that have pulled off, they're on their own. Are they completely disassociated from the main herds, or could you potentially, like, maybe you spot a group of elk, maybe it's a handful of cows and spikes, and they're over here, and you're like, okay, well, these elk are over here, but I'm looking at the topography, or there's this canyon or this hole. Like, will a bigger bull be like just like kind of close by or not with, where you can like use those other elk as like, you kind of gave this guy away potentially, and I think he might be down in this hole, or are they just like completely doing their own thing, disassociated?
I mean, they're doing their own thing, but there's enough elk around that like you'll see elk and then there might be another bull. You know what I mean? Like I wouldn't say that they're like, ooh, I'm going to follow this herd of cows. They're just doing their own thing, but oftentimes they're in the similar areas. So just because you see cows or a herd of elk doesn't mean that there won't be a bull in that canyon. He might just be somewhere else. And so that's one of the things that I like to do during that time of year, though, is just find places that are a little more glassable, because either that or still hunt some of that country, but that's a lot of work. So I think primarily what I like to do is just find a herd and kill a raghorn. That's great. just don't even worry about those other elk this time of year.
I think I'm on board with that program.
Yeah. Like, just come on.
I like it. What was I going to say? So we talked about pressure, a little bit of food, water, and cover, bow season versus rifle season. What other things are you doing to find elk, throughout the elk season?
Yeah, I mean, combination like using your optics is huge. You gotta be in your binos. And I don't care if we're talking long range glassing or close range glassing. I think the biggest mistake people make elk hunting is they're moving through an area that's like semi-timbered or whatever, and they aren't using their optics. I don't know how many times I've spotted like the ear of an elk. Like every time I come over a ridge or a finger ridge or a rise or whatever, I'm glassing, whether it's 100 yards or 600 yards. It doesn't matter. Like, you've got like a superpower in your optics, and you're going to be like, nah, I'm just going to live the normal life. I'm going to go Clark Kent and give up my, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just not going to put the cape on and be the superhero. Because, like, you have supervision, and people don't use it. It's insane to me. And it just baffles my mind how many people blow elk out that, that might have been your opportunity. So I think one of the big things is, like, don't mess up an opportunity by getting lazy on your optics. Like, I use them when I'm still hunting, when I'm walking, when I'm glassing, when I'm moving into where I'm expecting elk. I'm using them all the time, and that makes a big difference. Like, it's uncanny. And what I do, like when I'm in real, like even if I'm in timber, let's say we're going through a lodge pull, we're walking a ridge, and elk love to bed on those ridges. So as I'm walking, and then I'm like throwing my binos up and then just rolling that focus where it racks the focus between close and far, because it allows you to kind of see past the things that you get distracted with, and you go, oh, that's a weird color. Focus on that. Oh, there's an ear twitch. There's an ear. There's a eyeball. There's a whatever. And most of the time, it's just a piece of an elk that you see in that type of terrain.
I like that. I think that's a really good tip, and I mean, you make it very well. It's like, we're talking about finding elk. Well, what are you going to use to find elk? Well, you're really using your eyes a lot of the time. So why wouldn't you magnify,
100%. Yeah. Like, I mean, as a guide, I run into people, and it's just like, it's one of the things, like, we'll be like on a trail, and hunters will be like, oh, there's a guy here, and we'll know that we'll have seen elk there. Like, maybe we just saw him or whatever, and maybe we glassed him, whatever. And we'll run into someone up there and be like, they'll be like, oh, aren't you worried about this person? I'll be like, a person will not see these elk ever. Like, how do you know? I was like, I can tell. They don't have any binos out, or they're like, guys walk around with their binoculars in their backpack or whatever, and we'll talk to them. See any elk? Nope, haven't ever seen an elk in my life, and you're like, yep, right. There's elk there, but, we just, okay, cool. Yeah, no, we haven't seen anything either. And I'd be like, well, they're probably playing that same game, but 9 times out of 10, I don't think so. It's just like one of those things if you've done it enough, you can identify the people that are going to find the elk, and it's mostly like the guys that don't have or aren't using optics. It's very hard to find elk. Like, I don't know how many times I've not used my optics and seen them, right? Like, I was just in them all day, and by doing that, we find a lot of elk. So I think that there's definitely a correlation there.
For sure. And I agree. I think oftentimes, even when folks are using their optics, they think of it as like this, well, I'm looking far away, so that's when I need my binoculars or whatever. But, man, that in-close stuff is super important as well. And, like you said, you're going to see something that either maybe would have just gotten up and walked off, and you're like, oh, yeah, there was never an elk here. Or you're going to see it going away, and likely it's not going to matter that the elk was there or not, because it's, in getaway mode, and now you're kind of back to square one. So, yeah, I love, glassing in tight quarter scenarios. And like you said, just rolling that focus, if you haven't done it before, you'll be shocked at what you can see and what you can get a leg up on critters that are oftentimes not that close, but they're unaware of your presence, and they haven't left yet, and you're going to give yourself an opportunity that way for sure.
definitely. Especially in the middle of the day, if something's like you're expecting them to be bedded and you're moving through areas that they're likely to be bedded in, you want to pay attention.
Yeah, yeah. And it is so wild. Like you look, and I've done this 1,000 times, you look with your eyes, and it's just kind of like you kind of get to a point where it's just like a wall, and then you put your binos up, you're like, oh, man, I can like see through the wall. It's pretty cool. It's like X-ray vision.
It is. It's a superpower. It's like, you might as well use it,
Oh man, yeah, I know. For some reason, for me, man, like it's the finding of the elk, though, and I think a lot of the stuff that I've hunted, as of late in the last few years, like my home state's Washington, so I try and go hunt with my dad and my brother. We generally chase Roosevelts on the west side, and I think oftentimes we're chasing them in areas where at least I don't think there's a ton of elk, like covering some decent ground, not finding a ton of sign. I can't remember if we talked about this one in one of our previous podcasts talking about elk, but we were doing kind of what you're talking about. It was a muzzleloader season. I found this patch of timber, just looking at maps, which actually that's one thing that can be a little bit tricky, I find, and I think there's some really solid ways around it that I need to utilize more. But like when you're in timber country, you're looking at your aerials and you're like, oh yeah, there's a big piece of timber here, and you're like, oh wait, no, like that's reap rod now, like that's going to be pretty tough to get through. But this patch of timber was still standing, and we're just like creeping through it, super slow, doing a little bit of soft cow calling, ripped a couple bugles while I was in there, no response, and probably I bet I bugled the last time I bugled, we were inside of 100 yards of this elk that we hadn't seen yet, and we got up on this bull. He was just standing there feeding by himself in the timber, and my brother got a shot, and I guess typical Western Washington, but he clipped the side of a tree, and his muzzleloader bullet was deflected before getting to the bull. But it was a giant, but it was also like, well, maybe I am a terrible elk hunter, but we hunted 7 days, and that was the only elk we saw.
And that happened. That's like a common elk hunting story, like, oh, I don't know how many people I've guided, and they're like, I've been on 4 elk hunts, I've never seen an elk, and it's just like, that's, I think, the hard part for people elk hunting. One of the things that I stress is like, if you can hunt the same area multiple times, you're going to be in a lot better position because elk are so, in some ways, patternable, like when you really understand where they like to be in that area, you're a lot better off. It's a lot harder, like the first time, if you're like your first trip, like, man, it was difficult. I didn't find elk, or I started to find them late, whatever. But once you kind of are able to do that multiple times, you really kind of figure out where the elk like to be in that particular place. And that gives you a definite advantage for sure.
Yeah, no, 100%. And even like that last example that I was talking about, once we found that bull, when we finally saw him, I bet we were 45 yards from him, but seeing where he was at, you're like, okay, like he actually really wasn't that far from a road. And, a lot of the logging country that we hunt around there, like there's just so many logging roads. You're never really that far from a corresponding road. But it was interesting that just where he was, it's like there was a creek in the bottom, like it was beautiful open timber, so he could see it a little bit. But then also like it was almost like where in some ways where whitetails like to bed on, like just kind of like this point that jutted out into the creek. But man, one hop away and he was on the other side of the creek. Like he had a lot of advantages in that tiny little spot, and obviously mental note, right? Oh, big bull wanted to be right here when the pressure was on. So
for sure. Yeah, that's another thing. Like elk definitely like to bed on what I call like finger ridges, where it's like a ridge that comes off of a main ridge for a couple reasons. But the first one is because they've got multiple escape routes, right? So they can they want the wind coming downhill at their back where they can be like set up and comfortable. Elk like to live a life of comfort if they can. They'll be in some really steep country, but they generally like to bed where it's a little more flat. So in like super steep country, that's a little topography feature you could look for, is like, hey, this is real steep country. Where's a little ridge that benches out? Because a lot of times I'll find elk there. You think about like a herd of 15 elk, and like everybody's going to be bedded in a different position, and they want to be comfortable as well. So that works in their favor. Logging, like gated logging roads, work in their favor. They're like, cool, I'll walk this logging road, as opposed to just like busting through deadfall all the time or whatever. And not that they won't go through that stuff, but if given the option, they definitely like a life of comfort for sure.
For sure. Yes, as do I. What about maybe zigging when other people zag, Remi? And I guess we probably touched on this a little bit, but like as far as like is there anything that you're doing to find elk that just like a lot of other folks aren't? I want you gave me a tip one time. I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like people don't want to go. Well, you've talked about, I think it was multiple ridges, but you're like,
uphill both ways.
Yeah, uphill both ways. Exactly. Yeah. That's what I was trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I look for a lot of uphill both ways scenarios, and like it was like that doesn't exist, and like it definitely exists. It's like where you got to climb up, drop down, and then to get out, you got to climb back up. Nobody wants to pack an elk uphill. You know what I mean? So like find those pockets where you start hiking uphill and you end up hiking uphill. That's a good elk spot, right? Like. You try to save those for the at last, but it's a pretty tried and true tactic because it gets rid of 90% of the people.
I like it. When you're an old man telling your grandkids about how you used to hunt elk uphill both ways, you know.
Yeah, they're like, "What? It doesn't make any sense." Like, it does make sense. You start hiking uphill and you end up hiking uphill. Of course, there's a downhill at the very end, but like the two primary functions, like. It's like this. You go uphill, you come down here, you go back uphill, right? It's like to get out, you got to go uphill. To get there, you got to go uphill. It's uphill both ways.
It makes a lot of sense. Man, I think I'm out of ammo when it comes to questions here, Remi. Covered pretty much everything I had, unless you have anything else, any parting words of elk finding wisdom.
Let me think. If I were to think of one last parting thought to find elk, this is one thing that I would say is you kind of, when you're looking for elk, if you're used to looking for other things, maybe you've spotted an elk in the distance. This is something that I think we use a lot. You're looking at elk long ways away, right? You can actually spot elk from a very long, like, don't be surprised. I mean, there's oftentimes I'll spot elk 5 to 7 miles away. And because they're a larger animal, you just have to really know what you're looking for. But some in those distances, you can't be like, was that a legal bull? What is it? We use their body shape and color a lot to identify what we're looking at. So let's say you're looking like way the heck up there, and it's like this big basin. You're like, that would be an all-day, maybe multi-day trek to get in there. I don't want to get in there for a cow. Bulls often have blonde bodies, and I think that some people might not realize that, like especially at distance, like you can identify a bull with his blonde body. If it's got a really dark neck and a really light body, that's often a bull. Sometimes calves give that like illusion too, so you want to make sure like that blonde body is not a lot smaller than the other elk or nursing on a cow, right? But for the most part, like, and a bull is also a more blocky body, like more square looking because their bellies drop lower. So if you're trying to compare them and it's like too much heat signature, sometimes it's like real, like right at first light and you can't actually see their headgear at distance. We use a body color a lot to identify what we're going after. Now, the downside is sometimes that it means a spike. You can be like, hey, there was 3 bulls in that group. Well, we don't know what those bulls are, but we know that there's 3 bulls. It's worth going and investigating. And then you get there, it's like, crap, 3 spikes. Mature bulls definitely have that like real dark mane still, and then that really blonde body. But we use like body color for the most part to identify what we're looking at distance.
Yeah, and sometimes with that, it takes, once you see it, once you kind of are able to compare or even just like make mental note of that, I mean, yeah, oftentimes those bulls are super blonde. It actually makes me wonder like how they are able to hide sometimes, because you're you're actually like in some ways like brightly colored, but you're still very hard to see all the time.
Definitely.
But cool, Remi. Nope, that's a really good one. Appreciate the time. I know I always enjoy these discussions, particularly because I have an extremely difficult time finding elk. So hopefully these tips help everybody out there find their elk this year, and me as well, because I'm always looking. So thanks, Remi.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Awesome.
All right. Well, until next time, Remi, we'll catch you on the next one. Everybody out there, we'll catch you on the next one. Happy hunting and shooting, and hopefully you find that bull this fall.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.